With only one DLC remaining before the release of Total War Warhammer 3, you're all wondering who will take that coveted last spot before we move on to the Chaos Wastes. I've already shown you my predictions for the Dark Elf half of the DLC I'm calling the Master and the Monster, but now let's take a look at the half that really needs some love, the Beastmen. In this video, I'll show you what Lord I think will star, what new mechanics we could see, and what potential new units could arrive. And because this is a speculation video, I'll even cover what options didn't make the cut and why. At this point, the Beastmen are an albatross around the Creative Assembly's neck. Every time a new DLC releases, there is a flood of comments pointing out their sorry state of play. They're terribly unpopular, but it's a question of the chicken and the egg. Whether they sucked so they became the least played, or they're the least played because they were left to suck. But no company wants to go into a huge game release with less than absolute anticipation, so the time has come to banish the how many Charlemagne's meme back to Reddit hell. How, you may wonder, with a sweeping rework in the Wood Elves style. But who will lead this last charge of the Light Furry Brigade? Taurox the Brass Bull, the Slaughterhorn, Blood Beast, and the Brazen One. He consistently tops every poll asking who you would like to see as the next Beastmen Lord. Taurox is a huge minotaur with an insatiable bloodlust and metal-coated skin like the Silver Surfer from the Marvel comics. This metal-covered monster was blessed by the Chaos Gods after an especially bloody rampage, and now his shiny epidermis makes him darn near impossible to kill as he wades into unsuspecting peasants with two demonically inscribed axes, who is especially interesting as a lord as he's never been given an official Games Workshop model on the tabletop, and all the ones you see online are really kit bashes and homebrew imaginings. Yet still, Taurox was an official general option in the last edition of the Beastmen army. As a one-bull slaughter machine, Taurox would be hard-hitting and a vicious melee combatant, barreling through anything in his path. And while he would be quick for an infantry unit, his speed wouldn't exactly be blinding and he wouldn't get any mount options. But that wouldn't matter, because his axes are always on fire, and that's awesome. Interestingly, Taurox does have one weak point, a tiny soft spot on his throat that's not covered in metal, that allowed him to be instantly killed on the tabletop by 2 lucky dice rolls. So I'll be curious how and if that gets worked in. For a mechanic, I could see him with a bloodlust bar. The Chaos Gods demand constant sacrifices, and he's going to give it to them. So loot, kill, pillage, and generally desecrate your way to victory and be rewarded for it. Practically, it could either take the positive form, like Lu Bu's momentum mechanic from Three Kingdoms that allows him to spend points to reset his army movement and provides buffs to himself and his army, or a negative mechanic like Swin Tu, in that if Taurox doesn't live up to the Chaos God's expectations and spill enough blood, you get hit with increasing penalties and divine disappointment, so you must keep chopping your way to stay at the top of the pile. For a gameplay style, Taurox would make everything hit harder with faction effects to damage and allow you to recruit cheaper and more effective Minotaur units. I could talk about starting locations, but with Warhammer 3's combined map on the horizon, all of them would be subject to change anyway. So instead, let's talk about the legendary generals that didn't make the cut. If the original Beastmen Lord pack had included 4 lords, Gorthor the Beast Lord would have been one of them. As is, one of his major unique points was his chariot, which was given to Khazrak One-Eye instead, so he's not likely to appear here as that was the one fun thing about him. Gorthor is a hybrid caster fighter lord with access to the Lore of Death, which is cool, but existing lord choices make him feel as redundant as a second bumhole. Speaking of which, Ungrol Four-Horn. Does anyone really want another Gore Lord? I mean, he's a faster, scrappier version of Khazrak One-Eye with lower leadership and extra horns. Also, he has 2 heads, but half the brains even if they're combined. Every faction has their sly trickster rogue cut from the Loki and Joker cloth, but I mean, we've already got 3 Billy Goats Gruff in the Beastmen roster, so I'll take a pass on Ungrol Four-Horn. Slugtongue, the Famine Fiend, Lord of the Black Forest, is another caster lord. This one focused on death, decay, and famine, which is cool, but his magic lord role is already taken by Morgor the Shadowgave and Malagor the Dark Omen. It might be interesting to see him as a unique hero, but he really feels too samey to justify making him the headliner of this roster. And finally, Moonclaw, who you all voted as the lord you'd most like to see as a legendary hero, and I completely agree with you. The lunatic prince and child of the gravid orb, he is literally not of this world, having been shot out of the green moon Morschleb to land on Earth and wreak havoc. His only description seems to be a walking goatman skeleton that's always on fire like the Ghost Rider, and that's all we have to go on. As again, Games Workshop never made a model for him. You may be noticing a theme of the Beastmen getting the shaft way back on the tabletop days as well. Everything about Moonclaw is written as so OP that it begs to be an unlockable hero mid-game, or in the case of a DLC matchup, an opposing faction trying to stop his summoning. Moonclaw has lures of wild and shadow and a crazy two-headed mount crackling with raw fire, combined with a high ward save, magic resistance, and the ability to drive anyone around him insane. Also, he can call down a rain of warpstone meteors. But here's the rub. He'd also make a great legendary lord. He has a known objective of toppling waystones to bring about chaos in the end of the world, and he has a built-in ability called Unholy Zenith, which would make for an obvious campaign mechanic. See, Moonclaw gets his power from the moon Morschleb, and when it's completely full, he can summon his steed and radiate madness around him, gaining additional bonuses on the battlefield. But my personal feeling is that a moon mechanic would be too similar to the existing dark ritual mechanic, and frankly be too passive, requiring players to do nothing except wait around for 7 turns before you can do anything. And CA has really moved away from this, as active participation mechanics encourage you to keep playing, which is why I think we'll see Moonclaw as an Ariel or Lord Croak style magic super soaker that is summoned in mid-game. But if I'm going to be wrong, he's the one I want to be wrong on and see as a full lord. With every DLC comes an FLC, and based on the Wood Elves rework, we might expect another Beastman lord here to sweeten the pot. Ghorros Warhoof is a centaur lord from the Beastmen 7th edition army book, and of the remaining lords, he offers the most unique playstyle, focusing on speed and army movement while buffing centaurs, making his army into fast-moving, hard-hitting cavalry. Ghorros himself would be very fast-moving, with skills focusing on attacks and charge. His pseudonym is the Sire of 1,000 Young. Ghorros is a really big, old, horny horseman with entire herds made up of his litters, or whelps, or colts? I'm not actually sure what you call centaur children, but regardless, his mechanic could be based around this drunken debauchery. Ghorros' campaign is really all about the 3 R's, rutting, rooting, and raiding. Ghorros even carries around a giant magic club called Man Smasher, and wears the skull of a unicorn on his head, which gives him some magic resistance and also makes him an honorary brony and a pretty pony princess. But no matter how interesting Ghorros may be as a lord, if the Beastmen's mechanics aren't fixed, it won't matter. So I'm proposing a new Beastmen mechanic based on established Beast lore, all about pillaging and taking captives. See, early game, you're going to go around raiding villages to capture peasant women and then carry them back to your camp. And there, you'll hold them against their will to Stockholm Syndrome them into joining you. But really, it needs a timer to make this mechanic work. And this can be visualized by a flower of some kind, nature themed. Let's call it a rose, and each turn, a petal would fall off, so that if you don't accomplish your final mission before the flower dies, your horde dies too. But maybe that's copyrighted. Instead, let's talk about chosen gores, where a Beastman warrior has been marked by one of the Chaos gods as a powerful champion, making them Korngors, Pestigors, Slangors, and Zangors. It would work similar to the Norscan pledging system. After you raid a settlement, you can erect an altar to a god of your choosing or dedicate your victory to them, gaining their boons and buffs, culminating in a unique unit to unlock. Get a high enough rating with a god, and you'll have access to their special gores. You can see a version of this in action with the Pantheon system from Total War Saga Troy. This would address complaints about slow Beastmen growth and low rating income by incorporating buffs into the god effects. It's also a mechanic that would work for the Warriors of Chaos, who, if they don't get this exact mechanic, will get something very similar to it in the near future. Originally, I thought this Divine Favor mechanic would appear in Warhammer 3 for the undivided Daemons of Chaos, but since each god has their own faction now and are decidedly divided, the mechanic is no longer needed and, frankly, is better used here. But here's the thing, this mechanic is low-hanging fruit, something that already exists in Steel Faith Overhaul and several existing mods for the game. Herdstones are what would really set CA's version apart. In the lore, all Beastmen tribes live around herdstones, standing stones that are likely corrupted waystones. See, herdstones are always erected in places of magical significance, usually over one of the warpstone meteors that brought the Beastmen into being. Herdstones are sacred to the Beastmen, and all manner of captured weapons, armor, and bodies are left on them as offerings to earn the favor of the dark gods. As a mechanic, herdstones could only be built on certain specific important locations throughout the map, and if you manage to raise a location and then build a herdstone, it would provide a safe haven of sorts to rest your tribe and refuel for your next push, and would help give a sense of destination and progress to these wandering horde campaigns. You can also possibly build altars to a specific god, giving constant flows of favor to them. Again, an idea seen on Total War Saga Troy. What makes herdstones unique lore-wise is that when an enemy army comes within 100 leagues of a herdstone, every war herd in the region descends on them in a frothing rage. They're also used to gather together the wandering war bands. Currently, new Bray herds use a version of the old Wah mechanic from the Greenskins. Once you raise your bestial rage mechanic high enough, an AI-controlled army is spawned, that then sods off to do whatever it pleases because it's an AI and it makes them useless. Instead, what if your herdstones unlocked new armies? CA could make it so that you only have a single army until you erect a new herdstone, making it similar to how Tomb King's technologies unlock new armies. Or maybe constructing a herdstone grants you a new fully built army. It's possible CA could even summon a new AI-controlled army at that location to keep and hold the herdstone, and help keep out unwanted settlers like the Nakai the Wanderer campaign. And there's so many ways the herdstone mechanic could be flavored, which would change them from being just another slobbering horde. But now let's talk about new units. CA normally averages 4 or 5 units per DLC, of which only 1 or 2 will be big new showcase units that require new models and animations. A new generic lord is a must. Beastmen can currently only recruit one general type, the Beast Lord, so a Great Bray Shaman is a shoo-in, as it makes it so a Caster Lord is available in the general options. As he's so important to the updated roster, I would expect Great Bray Shamans to be released as a free DLC through Total War Access. Normally, when CA releases a DLC Lord, they include a depowered version for other factions to recruit, in this case, called a Doom Bull, an upgraded Gore Bull with accompanying bonuses to Minotaurs. Think of him as generic Taurox. War Gors would be a new melee duelist-oriented hero unit. They would also make it so the Beastmen would have at least 3 hero options, like every other faction in the game, minus Bretonnia, but that's a whole different issue. War Gors were originally a hero unit on the tabletop, and it makes sense for them to continue here as an elite infantry unit that encourages the troops around them and has decent armor. They're not very flashy as units go, but they serve a utilitarian purpose and would be very easy to implement. Tusk Gore Chariots. Cheap, very fast chariots meant to be a step below the existing Razor Gore chariots. Much like the Glade Riders with spears in the Twisted and Twilight DLC, they would help to round out the Beastmen's early game, which can be very problematic, providing a cheap early game chariot for fast flanking units. Gorehoofs, armored Centaurs. Originally a leader promotion in the 6th edition army book, one Centaur could be named a Gorehoof, but here they would be an entirely new unit of armored cavalry. Generally, people want the Beastmen to move faster and hit harder. They want the Bray Herd, and this gives it to you. By the end of the game, Beastmen struggle to keep up with other factions except for a few tanky monster units. Gorehoofs would be bigger and meaner and also synergize well with a Ghorros Warhoof FLC Lord. Gorgons. Huge monsters similar to giants, except they're faster and harder hitting. The trade-off is that they also have lower health and armor. It would be interesting to see them in an anti-cavalry or anti-large role, speeding around, counteracting cavalry charges, and using them to prevent flanking. For an example of how awesome they are, you can actually see one in Chaos Roby's existing mod. And finally, Jabberslyths. Just to shut everyone up about it. Realistically, the Beastmen don't have many missing units, and the Jabberslyth was such an iconic part of their tabletop roster for a reason. It's a monster that flies and has regen, attacks with terror, and poison. Think of it like the Vargulf for the vampire counts, which I suspect this model will be based on if it does make it into the game. Again, they're so popular, there's even a mod of them. When it comes to Gorgons and Jabberslice, we may turn out this is a pick one scenario. The fact remains, Beastmen are not popular, but I don't see CA ending Warhammer 2 on a whimper. They want to be seen as generous purveyors of awesomeness with Warhammer 3 on the horizon. If the Beastmen get a 5th unit, it will be one of these next few here. Basilisks. Very easy to implement as it's a reskinned ancient salamander from the Lizardmen, but more than a bit boring because of that. Basilisks originally appeared in the Monstrous Arcanum Addendum book for Warhammer tabletop battles and were never a core unit for the Beastmen. They were very much added later. They also have poisoned attacks and were generally used against infantry, and if you want to try one, it's also available as a mod. I know I sound like a broken record when I say that, but it bears in mind as to whether CA will make it themselves. They don't want to come across like they've stolen someone else's work, but at the same time, it shows them that there's a demand for these units. Chimeras and Cockatrice. Both would require completely new models and animations, and their role is already largely filled by the Feral Manicore, being large flying monsters that navigate the battlefield. Also, they're Age of Sigmar units, which doesn't necessarily rule them out, as I previously said I want to see the chosen Ghorros, but it doesn't help their case either. Incarnate of Beasts and Praetons, both of which look super grimdark and hail from the Monstrous Arcanum, the same text of additional cool models that we dipped into earlier. With so many core units still missing from the Beastmen roster, there's little need to pull from extra content. While both would be welcome additions, I feel like they're long shots compared to the Jabberslice and the Gorgon. If they make it in, it will be an addition to these others as opposed to replacing them, and that's what I would expect from a new Beastmen DLC. But there is a hitch in all of this. CA previously gave something additional to original buyers of the old Wood Elf DLC to keep them happy and to frankly encourage new people to go buy the old packs. And Ghorros isn't really likely to make people want to go back and buy old DLC, but somebody else would. Boris Todbringer, who you overwhelmingly want to see as the Free Lord. The biggest argument I've seen against bringing him in this way is that Boris would need his very own Middenland DLC to properly get in all the necessary units. For unique units, Boris requires Priests of Ulrich, Knights of the White Wolf, Knights Panther, Teutogen Guard, Warriors of Ulrich, Hunting Hounds, and Wolfkin. Teutogen Guard are Empire captains with wolf cloaks, big beards, and two-handed hammers. All those things are already in the game. Knights of the White Wolf are the same guys, but they put them on horses. Knights Panther are Empire Knights with a panther cape. What I'm trying to say is that all of Boris's units can be made from tweaking existing Empire units, and modders have already done exactly that. While it's technically enough to make a DLC from, it doesn't feel flashy enough to sell. If CA put a bit extra into his campaign exclusive units like they did with Dryka's campaign, it would do the exact same thing. And it's not like Boris can be offered as a free LC unit for a future DLC. He already came in with the original Beastmen. They blew their load. Giving all this to Boris would make that old Beastmen DLC seem a hell of a lot more attractive to people in the future. For mechanics, an idea from Double M Double Fun would have Toddy's campaign work like Eltharion's, a countdown timer building up the defenses of Middenland, with many invasions of Beastmen along the way to keep it spicy. You'd need to sally out and fight Beastmen invasions as they spawned to keep from being overwhelmed before a final invasion of chaos. He would get a unique siege map of Middenheim, which would feature Ulrich's Thunder, a giant cannon defending the city that feels like a super tower defending your walls and would shoot anyone coming nearby, and again, that and all of its functionality are already in a mod for the game called GCCM. There's even a blank spot on the east side of the Empire that begs to have a playable legendary lord stuck in it. Boris is so different from Ghorros that there's a case for both of them being made free and available. One for Warhammer 2 owners, and the other for owners of the original Warhammer 1 Beastmen DLC. And I can hear you. CA only ever releases one FLC lord at a time. And you're right, this would be something new, but wouldn't it be cool? You know, I mean, wouldn't it be like, yeah, they do listen. But what do you think? Is this all pie in the sky, or could you see this happening? That's the fun of speculation, and I can't wait to see what the actual final Warhammer 2 DLC really holds. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to be notified when or like it release, or even join our Patreon to help make them possible. After all, this one was sponsored by viewers just like you. As always, thanks for watching.